So I'd like to just start out, speaking of context, I'd like to say something about what made Russia different from other parts of Europe when they came into the early 20th century, what defined Russia and what's going to affect the art. Well, first of all, a very obvious thing, revolution came late to Russia. There was a revolution in 1905 and then another, the Bolshevik revolution, later in 1917. So what we call a revolution, it was really a series of events sandwiched, with turmoil in between. But it came much later to Russia than it came to other nations, more than 100 years, for example, after the French Revolution. Russia had a peculiar situation culturally in that imperial Russia was really dominated by French culture. French was spoken in the court, and French painting was the most admired style of painting. The palaces of imperial Russia look a lot like Versailles. That's what they were trying to imitate. So there was this kind of sense of there being a foreign culture within Russian culture. There were in the 19th century, there were academic painters in Russia, even some very outstanding ones. And the realist painters, including Repin, whose work I'll show you in a minute, often showed very straightforwardly, they showed the difficulties of Russian life and of peasant life. And that's a kind of an interesting context for what would happen next in modernism. And of course, here's one of the greatest problems. Russia was impoverished. It was far behind the rest of Europe industrially in its development. It was really still, in most respects, it was a feudal society, and it was a very corrupt society at the top. So that sets the stage for Russia. I'd also like to acknowledge that one of the greatest, maybe the greatest Russian tradition in art going back historically had been the tradition of religious icons. And I'm going to say that icons and iconography, that was the popular art of the Russian people, and it was going to influence what happened in terms of modernity. If you look at the imperial palaces of Russia, I just want you to kind of get this visual as a contrast for what we're going to look at. Look at the fantastic splendor. And you would have thought that the Russians would learn from the French that when you build great grand palaces, revolution is next. But I guess nobody was particularly thinking about that. But here's the Hermitage, or excuse me, the Kremlin, completed in 1849, just like the kind of Baroque and Rococo extravagance that you'd see in French architecture. In realism, here's a painting by the great artist Repin, who of course was trained in France. And you can see that along with this bit of splendor in the form of the religious kiosk, there is the reality of the Russian people and the kind of drabness of the setting. It gives you another picture to have in your mind as we look at Russian modern art. So when the revolution was complete after 1917, obviously there were extraordinary problems faced by the new communist society and government. But the one we're concerning ourselves was, well, what about art? What are you going to do about art in this brand new society? Obviously, there were a lot of statues to be dismantled. Like you can see the statue of Tsar Nicholas, gigantic figure that is about to be taken down and melted down to make probably factory implements. But what do you do to establish a new artistic tradition? And how do you portray your new leader? How are you going to show Lenin differently than you might have shown the Tsar? Practical problems for artists to solve. And of course, the main thing that showed up over the next years, and it's kind of the response you'd expect, is there was a great deal of what you and I would just call out and out narrative propaganda. Propaganda that told stories. In this one, it's almost a trope. We had the giant Tsar being taken down in the last slide. Now we have the giant Lenin making a variation on, looks a little bit like a variation on the, I don't know, the fascist salute or the Roman salute, but with the thumb up. Lenin seems to never smile except in rare photographs, but he gives this forward motion to airplanes and to soldiers and to the red flags and to industry. And it's very, very direct and very understandable, but it really isn't in any particular way a fresh image. So some of the artists who, even before and during the revolution, began to experiment with the idea of what could modern art in Russian be, they include this couple, Goncharova and Larionov. And when you look at the development of their work, you see something that's characteristic of a lot of Russian early modernism. And that is, you kind of see a foot in both camps. And what I mean by that is you see modernity, but you also see tradition, and you see these two things trying to work themselves out. Here in this 1908 painting of peasants, you get the feeling that somebody must have been looking at Matisse, looking at French modern art, with the boldness in the new colors and the simplicity of shapes. It's a rather flattened, stylized image, but of course the subject matter of flowers and plants and kind of working in the fields and harvest is utterly tradition and utterly Russian, as are the outfits. You know, a French painter would have been painting exotic scenes. I know, you know, Matisse did odalisques or nudes. Well, we certainly don't have nudes in this picture. We have peasant women in the field. And as their art progressed, and I don't know if progressed is the right word, but as they, you know, moved forward in their career, they tried to develop imagery. There certainly was an attempt in this painting to say something good about the peasant experience. You know, using this kind of hyper flattened style, we have a father and sons harvesting wheat. It's clear and it's bold and it's stylized. Anybody can read it in a way. I guess in that sense, it's a little bit like the Lenin poster. And I think what these artists achieved is what one commentator called Neoprimitivism. It almost is an anti-academic kind of self-taught primitive style of art. But it also, you know, connecting, maybe it connects to French modernism as well. It's another one of these in-between styles or moments. Or in this Larionov image of a Cossack, that even has some letters, Cyrillic letters inscribed on it. Again, you get that neo-primitivism, like a storybook image, almost something made for a child. And yet the intention is to glorify the role of the Cossack. Now, keep in mind what I said early in the lecture, that religious art always loomed large in the Russian spirit, in the popular spirit. So Goncharova, for example, was very, very conscious of that and did make religious paintings, modernizing or flattening them, using you know, bold yellow oil paint, where a Byzantine artist might have used gold foil instead, but trying to come up with a new variation of that. But by 1912 and 1913, when you know, magazines showing cubism began to make their way to Russia, I think these artists both realized what everybody would realize inevitably, is that to be modern, you had to try the modern styles. And this painting, I have to say, it's a painting that when you know, the more that you look at it, the more you may be inclined to laugh, because this is an attempt at making a truly modern painting, kind of a breakthrough painting. And you can see it's cubist in style. It represents the speed of the bicyclist moving forward in these kind of multiple sequences. You can see the kind of the echo of the bike tire and the echo of the man's body. And of course, it's meant to be like a futurist painting. It's meant to be an image of speed. And the speed is probably, I don't know, he's late to work, so it's 15 miles an hour. He's pedaling as hard as he can, maybe 20 miles an hour. And he's passing by the bulletin boards of the modern city, which kind of humorously include this finger that points backwards. But if this had been an Italian painter, it would have been an automobile. But in Russia, there weren't many automobiles. So of course, it's a factory worker on his bicycle. When Goncharova continued exploring cubism, she painted the laundry, which of course we'd now say, well, you know, it's women's work and it has nothing to do with modernity. It's something that had gone on for a long time. And in fact, she includes lacework, you know, which is a delicate handmade item. So again, you get that feeling of being between two eras as the artist struggles to find a way forward. And the artist who eventually did the most radical thing possible to bring Russian art into the modern world, I want to add a kind of a correction to this because everybody's been talking about it. We're going to call him a Russian modernist, but maybe we shouldn't, because he was Ukrainian and Polish. And everybody has been pointing that out lately. But this was Kazimir Malevich, the great revolutionary of Russian modernism. And like Goncharova and Larionov, who he knew, he was an artist that ran his way through modern styles. He was trying to find his way as an artist. So in 1908, he is a sort of a cubist, making these heavy, sculpted peasant figures. And then he very, very consciously looked at French art. He was looking at Picasso. He was looking at Braque. You can see that his Bather from 1910 has so much in common with the Braque nude of 1908. And he's just, 2 years behind. So he's not too much of a late adopter of Cubism. He looks at Futurism. And when he looks at Futurism, look at this fantastic comparison. On the left is his knife grinder. And what a Russian subject, a knife grinder, somebody you would have seen in the public market along where they were selling fish and fowl, but in this fantastic Cubo-futurist style with all this emphasis on energy and movement, compared to Boccioni's Soccer Player, where the body of an athlete is abstracted into motion. And you can see that Malevich is what my dad would have called a quick study. He really is picking up more quickly than other artists on other modern styles. And then he, tries a Braque style still life with a violin. And to me, this is almost like a joke. In fact, I'll say the joke because I'm thinking it. How do you tell the Russian Cubist painting from the French Cubist painting? The answer is the Russian painting has a cow in it. That's my punchline, because you can see he's learning so much from Braque. He's working with the same subject matter, and yet he's in Russia, and the cow is the difference. He also has a kind of a destructive, kind of a nihilistic Dada moment where he abstracts the Mona Lisa and crosses out her face and puts it in this kind of non-objective Cubist composition with elements of collage. I think he's been looking at Picasso and getting the idea of collage. And I looked at this and I was thinking to myself, this has so much in common with the guy who went and put cake on the Mona Lisa in the Louvre, just a few days ago. Because I guess if you want to make a statement, you attack the Mona Lisa, and that always gets, attention because she's the exemplar of a certain kind of Western tradition. So anyways, Malevich goes through all of this, looking at other moderns, all of this copying, even this kind of destructive moment. And then he gets involved in 1913 in the development of an opera. And this grand opera, which is an avant-garde opera filling up with avant-garde ideas, is called The Victory Over the Sun. And in this play, which has been recreated, it got recreated in Brooklyn in 1983, there are a group of very, very strange protagonists who want to destroy reason. And the way they're going to get rid of reason, they're going to dispose of time, and they're going to capture the sun. And Malevich made kind of Picasso-style Cubist costumes for the main characters. By the way, there was one character called Nero/Caligula, and there was another character who was talking on the telephone, which of course was very, very modern, Edison's invention. And apparently the opera was, it went on very, very short period and almost caused riots because nobody could understand it. But from it came some ideas. And this is a sketch, I think, for one of the stage decorations, but Malevich also created a curtain for this opera that was going to come down. And from the curtain and from these geometric decorations for the opera, he came to this. It came to the image that I have behind me on my screen share today. He came to his black square, or homage to the square, whatever you'd like to call it. And you can get a feeling of the scale. Here's a woman looking at it. I think it's at the Tate, possibly MoMA. I should have found out, but you can see it being looked at here in a gallery. And of course, all it is, what you see is what you get. It is, I'm thinking, probably a square of cardboard, because that's what Malevich would have had available. And it is a very, very simple gouache square. Maybe he did it with tape on the edges, maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but it was a kind of an ultimate work of art. This was the beginning of what he called Suprematism. And of course, he said with great flair and drama in his writings that this was going to be the supreme style of art. And one more way to think about this, think about the kind of religious experience that people had had for years in the great Byzantine, in the Eastern Orthodox churches, this feeling of gold halos, of saints, of icons, of candlelight. And that is everything that Malevich's work is not. Malevich's work is kind of a great cancellation that just says, maybe a good metaphor, we have a blank slate. We have something non-objective. Subject matter is gone. Skill in art making is gone. Referentiality is gone. Religion is gone, because remember, religion is the opiate of the masses. And even though religion is gone, it's interesting that some of the other suprematist icons that Malevich would make, we have one here that appears to be a cross, or another one you could interpret as a sun or as a moon or an eclipse or a planet. But Malevich, like so many artistic theorists, tended to negate his own statements. He actually said one time to someone who asked about it, he said, "Oh no, that cross is not the cross. It's something different entirely." To get a feeling for what Malevich was trying to do, you can read his writings, and I'm going to warn you, or maybe I shouldn't, but my impression is that his writings are paradoxical and confusing. And of course, they have the feeling of a manifesto. They have the feeling of a grand statement where someone is telling you, this is how it is. It's not a discussion. But here are some quotes that I'll read you from a pamphlet that he put out called New Systems in Art, 2 years after the Bolshevik Revolution. And I think they should be read stridently. Aesthetic control is rejected as being a reactionary measure. What's that mean? I think it means that he's in control, is what I get from it, and not aesthetic control. He says all of the arts, painting, color, music, constructions, they're under the umbrella of technological creation. So I'm going to take that to mean there's this new emphasis on what can a factory make rather than what can an artist make. And there's also this reference that, everything, every kind of creation is now going to be modernized and, put under this new umbrella of a whole different way of making things. He recognized labor as the relic of an old world of violence. And he says the contemporary world is built on creation. So of course he was thinking of the situation of labor in Russia and serfdom and the violence that maintained that kind of a system. And then finally, he rejects what he calls the spiritual force of content as belonging to the vegetable world of flesh and bone. And that's very, very hard to parse that statement. But let's just say he doesn't like content. Content is going to be something that is literal and tells you what something is. And he wants to avoid content and give you something absolutely fresh and non-objective. So as suprematism develops, the geometry sometimes multiplies, it spreads out. It does have a little sense of dancing. It's a little bit uneven. It doesn't have to be laid out strictly on a grid. It doesn't have to be always horizontal or vertical. And it should be noted that Malevich, I don't know if he was a pilot, but he had been in airplanes. He considered himself an aviator. So if you get a little bit of a feeling of an aerial view from Malevich, from Suprematism, maybe that's one way you could translate it into something you could recognize. He stayed with a very, very limited group of colors, the primaries plus black, and began to make these kind of formations or abstract compositions. I'm sure as art people, you're familiar with this, but you call them non-objective, that in his view, there really shouldn't be a reference to things. And this has been colorized. You may have seen this photo before in black and white, but here's a colorized photo where someone went in with Photoshop and recreated his exhibition of 1918. What it would have been like to walk into a room of these, hung kind of unevenly. And one detail I appreciate is that his initial painting, that black square, is actually hung in the corner right below the roof. So it's almost like I'm going to call it the eye of God that looks down on you, that's canted down into the exhibition. And that's kind of this new world, new universe of non-referential imagery that Malevich hoped would replace other artistic traditions. Now, of course, his ideas spread, just like Picasso's ideas spread. And you can see that in planning for cities and for architecture, there began to be a kind of a suprematist purity in what was envisioned. This is an abstract sculpture that was never made, but one of his companions, Nathan Altman, had this idea that you could bend huge sheets of steel and also have a giant cube put into concrete at an angle. And these were going to be the new sculpture that would replace representational sculpture. And you could decorate the great imperial palaces with these kinds of sculptures. It really didn't happen until Richard Serra came along, let's say in the 1970s or 80s, that we got these kind of grand sheet sculptures, but the concept was there in 1918. Where Suprematism really made an impact, and this will be the last part of today's lecture, but it really made an impact in graphic design, in the kind of the boldness, the geometry of that. Graphic designers learned from that. And you can see in this double image propaganda poster how we have sort of a before and after. The workers were really, under the gun in the first image with the Tsar's police looking them over, but now they're marching in the streets, they're free, they are carrying their proud red banners, they're in this kind of geometric city, and you can see that with good graphic design, you now get happy workers. And yes, you probably knew this was coming. There were Suprematist dishes, which I don't know if you can buy them at Target or IKEA, but they may feel like products that you've seen. The real ones are actually very, very rare because I think only prototypes were made. But you can, if you know the works of the Bauhaus, of the Germans, Malevich was much more influential in Germany eventually than he was in Russia. And this idea of high art and high craft finding a union and then being industrial produced and taught that way, you can see it here in this tea set. So, in a very short time after making the black square, he made what he considered his ultimate, and to me, ultimate means final, but that wasn't the case, but his ultimate composition, White on White of 1918. And if you really spend time with it, there are two different whites in the picture. The blue of the square itself is a little bit, the white of the square is a little bit slightly blue. It's a cooler white. There's a warmer white around it. And of course, this square is turning just a little bit because although this is essentially a flat painting, Malevich did want to give you some idea that maybe there's something that could move, maybe there's some kind of space in the work. And there is a raw canvas edge, very, very thin, around the inner square. But white on white, obviously goes to a whole different, kind of chroma, goes to lightness and attempts to make a final statement. And if you're wondering, after this explosion of, really a very, very advanced kind of art, or let's say a very radical kind of art, more radical in its own way than what Picasso and Matisse were doing, you got to wonder, well, what happened? What happened after this fantastic radical statement? Well, in 1919, Malevich became one of the first of a long line of people to declare painting dead. We've all heard that. But he announced the end of painting and the end of Suprematism, although quietly he continued to paint and he continued to teach. And what this probably came from was that all around him, the party especially, but also even his peers, were maybe realizing that as art, this didn't have much of a future. Very few people really responded to it. What people wanted was, more along the lines of what they had wanted before the revolution. So maybe he kind of, said goodbye before he could be declared a public failure. He became increasingly mystic and wrote in very, very spiritual terms. He wrote that the cross is my cross in one of his notebooks. Officially, it took a few years, but Suprematism had been embraced by the party very, very briefly, but then it was declared a disgraced style. And interestingly, a lot of his work ended up in Germany, and the interest in his work was in Germany. And it wasn't there until maybe the 50s or 1960s that I think American art historians got interested and kind of began to tell the story of Suprematism and the story of Malevich. And he died relatively unknown at the age of 57 in 1935. So there were other artists who took this radicalism to some degree, who took it in different directions. And a lot of the energy went into another manifestation, another style that we call constructivism. And as the title implies, it's about a rational kind of art that you build rather than, let's say, create or paint. You use kind of different verbs. Vladimir Tatlin was an artist known for his constructivist artwork. And we saw in our earlier lectures how important Picasso was, inventing constructed sculpture, inventing collage. And I think we saw these two, one is a tin and the other is cardboard. We saw these guitars by Picasso. Tatlin was very, very taken with these, taken with the idea that you could make sculpture out of a factory-made flat material by snipping and welding and sculpting. So he began to make, as early as 1915, these works that he called reliefs. And this one, like Malevich's Black Square, was installed in a corner. And look at the materials, little bits of metal, little bits of wire. It's suspended by metal wire. And I don't know this for a fact, but I'm just kind of guessing that this must have been a time of scarcity. So probably even getting a hold of scraps was kind of an accomplishment. The bronze was going into other things or would have been too expensive. And I don't know if Tatlin worked in a factory or had friends that worked in a factory, but he really used cast-offs to make his art. And in some of them, you can see in the black and white photo, that one is set in a kind of a tray that I may think have concrete or plaster in it that makes the object stand up. There's another one here which is recreated on the right, and you can see that it has a little piece of wood in it. Maybe, I don't think it's plywood, but you can see the wood grain around the edge. So he's bringing together whatever he could get his hands on, wood, plaster concrete, bits of metal, but they aren't the traditional art materials. We're not talking about oil paint on canvas, for example, or bronze sculpture on a pedestal. So constructivism is, you construct it, you use the same tools you might use in a factory. You don't use typical art supplies. And of course, then and now, or maybe especially then, it doesn't look like art. And the person who makes it is a little bit more the mindset of a factory worker or an architect or an engineer, rather than having the mindset of a traditional fine artist. And this was very, very much admired. Among some of the people who admired it were the Dada artists in Germany. And Ruhl Hausmann, who we learned about in the Dada lecture, made this very well-known photo collage of Tatlin at home. And you can see coming out of his mind is a kind of a industrial lathe and some other tools that spring out of him. And part of a gear or a wheel becomes one of his eyeballs. And to the Dada artists, Tatlin was an example of rationalism. It was an example of what they should strive for, a truly modern man who was thinking about the factory reality of the future, thinking like an engineer, not thinking like, in their view, the politicians who had led them into war. It was more productive. And one of the ideas of constructivism is you produce. Your creativity is in making monuments and objects that people can enjoy and people can use. So along with a number of his students, Tatlin created a model and an idea for a monument that was going to be grander and larger than the Eiffel Tower. And of course, it never got built. There wasn't enough steel in all of Russia to make it. And it's been proved by engineers since that if you did make it, I mean, you couldn't make it. It absolutely would have collapsed. It was not so sound in terms of engineering. But wow, was it ambitious. And what I'd like to do is show you a 2-minute video. And the 2-minute video will kind of give you a feeling for the scale of this and how it was supposed to work and what it was, going to be used for. And you'll be impressed with just the raw ambition of Tatlin and his students.
My nomination is for an object that expresses the power of unbuildable ideas. Almost 100 years ago, the Russian artist Vladimir Tatlin would have been found perched up a stepladder in his studio in Petrograd. Tatlin and his assistants spent most of 1920 designing and building a scale model of a tower that they wanted to be the tallest structure in the world. The model was unveiled in Tatlin's studio and later displayed at exhibitions in Moscow. The monument to the Third International had been commissioned by Lenin, who wanted to mark the 3rd anniversary of the Russian Revolution and inspire communists around the world. Even as a model, it was a breathtaking sight. The newspaper Pravda commented that it was an enormous brain twister of a thing. It soared 400 meters into the sky and would have been a third taller than the Eiffel Tower. Its arched base was to straddle the river Neva in Petrograd, while a massive diagonal girder represented the Earth's axis. Tatlin's tower was praised by critics at the time for being a new type of monument, one that was innovative and artistic, but also contained offices and an information center for the Comintern, a sort of UN for worldwide communist parties. It wasn't just bold in its structural form, which was a spiral enclosing 4 kinetic chambers. It used information as a form of power, incorporating the latest multimedia technology to project news and images onto the clouds and broadcast live information around the Soviet Union and Europe. It was described as a disseminator of living words. Tatlin's model tower disappeared in the 1920s and was later criticized for being an unbuildable folly. It would have used up more steel than Russia could produce, said critics such as Robert Hughes, who called it a grandly useless conception. But that's not the point. The power of Tatlin's tower is as an idea. It inspired thousands of Russians who saw it at exhibitions, and images of it appeared around the world in newspapers and magazines. It sent a message of solidarity and raised aspirations about what's possible. Today, more than ever, we need the power of unbuildable ideas.
I didn't hear any complaints, so hopefully her sound came through well on that. I hope you were able to hear her because she gave a good description of just how ambitious and varied it was going to be. Also coming out of Constructivism, this is Naum Gabo, who I think later taught at Harvard. I think he came to the United States and was influential, but as early as 1916, he tried to do recognizable imagery. He tried to make human heads out of sheet constructions. And you see here, I think, a recreation of a head that he designed in 1916. And there's Gabo later in a park with one of his sculptures. Another artist, Rodchenko, was very, very interested in making sculpture that was both spatial, but also non-objective, highly abstract. He made a whole series of what he called spatial constructions. And here's a point that I think a lot of you will recognize from more recent modern art. He insisted on using numbers rather than titles. So you get number 11, number 15, number 2. They didn't have to have personalities, or they didn't have to be named. If you could have seen an exhibition of Rodchenko's work in Russia, this is what it would have looked like. Some pieces standing on the floor, others, painting-like objects on the wall, constructions hanging from the ceiling. You were kind of going into this abstract universe to encounter his work. And he was a fantastic graphic designer. This is a beer ad he did that's meant to show you just how much pressure is built up in the beer bottle. Kind of different from the Schlitz ad we had, where they show the cups with the foam coming off the top. But he's really letting you know that factory-made beer really packs some pressure. And he does it with this kind of fantastic, symmetrical, bold lettered advertising. Here's another one that's in Shocker the New, his light bulb advertisement. And look at the way he frames the light bulb between 2 arrows. It's almost like you can't get away from the light bulb. And with a giant exclamation point, it tells you to get down to the government department store, get down to GUM and get yourself a light bulb. And after seeing this ad, who wouldn't want to get in line for a light bulb at GUM? Very, very dynamic advertising. Ivan Poony was, I'm going to kind of say, the smoldering Brad Pitt of Russian modernism. His relief included an actual hammer, so that you can see the imagery itself is very, very minimal. It's folded sheets of cardboard or paper, but the real hammer, brought this into the world of industry in a very literal way. El Lisitsky developed a whole series of abstract imagery that he called prunes, P-R-O-U-N-S. I don't know if you say proun or prune, maybe proun like noun. I don't know how it translates. But in a whole series of gouaches, he used things that now we'd be generating on a computer, perspectival grids, three-dimensional cubes, geometric forms and shapes. He numbered them, going through sequences and series. And you could, like you could do with Malevich, maybe you could imagine them as architecture, but I better like the idea that you imagine them as a kind of a grammar, as if he's saying, let's build a whole new style of art out of this grammar, out of these forms, almost some of the forms that Cezanne would have used, but pruned down to lose their recognizability. And he also created this very, very famous image of the Bolshevik victory. He showed the whole Bolshevik party as a kind of a wedge that was breaking through against the Menshevist whites and ultimately was going to triumph. And to him, triumph was something you could reduce to geometry for the purposes of graphic design. Photo montage or photo collage was being invented both in film and in flat imagery during this period. And we were talking about Lenin earlier. I think that's the only image I've ever seen of Lenin smiling. I don't know how they got that, but they really put together in this photo montage all of the kind of vaunted and approved Soviet activities, happy factory workers, happy people in the street, happy people harvesting together. And it's something we would easily now do in Photoshop, but it was revolutionary to combine images back in this time. He designed children's math textbooks, and look at this delightful page. When you look at 1 + 1 + 1, you get the forge worker, you get the farmer, and you get the soldier. And if you add them all up, what do you get? You get 3 comrades marching in service of the party, each with their own kind of letter forming their body. Absolutely inventive and delightful. So constructivist typography lived a lot longer than suprematism in painting. So bold, so modern, so graphic and attention-getting. And El Lissitzky actually made his final poster in 1942. And in that time, he was, warning about Hitler's armies and Air Force and the Germans, but he used the grammar of suprematism and with this great exhortation at the bottom, everything for the front, everything for victory. So even though, let's say at this point, Malevich might have been disgraced or forgotten, that contribution, his ideas about reducing imagery, his ideas about abstracting for power, stayed with Russian art and then were influential to modern art across the world.